we had gotten quite good at what we thought were second acts because we had been replicating the platform to serve new demographics really, really effectively. Like we had gone in reality 0 to a couple of 100,000 patients really, really fast. And so we thought like, okay, well, the next logical one is to, instead of going horizontal, to now increase depth. But the heuristics we had around how to increase depth came from the world of going horizontal. And so we completely fucked the attempt to increase depth. Even when you have a machine that's capable of doing new things, which ours was, when you change the shape of the new thing, you have to go back to square one and plan, what does this actually look like? Where is the opportunity? How big is the scale, et cetera, et cetera.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Tim Doyle.
Today we're going to talk about what to do when your startup has succeeded in building its first product, achieving success in its first market, and now you're looking to expand to new markets, to new products, to new adjacencies. This is a really exciting time for your startup, but it's also a time that is fraught with risk and danger. So on today's episode, we have Tim Doyle, founder of Eucalyptus, who has been there, done that, learned the lessons, and he has so much wisdom to share on how best to think about expanding into those adjacencies. Now, Tim is one of our favorite founders. He's outspoken. He has really clear, incisive thinking. And my level of brain explode, new learnings per minute is one of the highest we've had on any of our episodes for a long time. So this is an absolute banger. We know that you'll enjoy it. Stay tuned for the full episode right after this break. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. I get it. You hear security and compliance and you think time-consuming and stressful, but it's critical for scaling your business. Achieving compliance with ISO 27001, SOC 2, Essential 8, or other in-demand frameworks can unlock major growth for your company, help you sell to the enterprise, and establish customer trust. And with Vanta, you can get compliant in weeks instead of months and save up to 85% of associated costs. And just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast. Okay, folks, I wanted to talk to you about YouTube. We've been publishing our podcast to YouTube for over a year now. If you haven't checked us out there, I recommend you do. You get to see our beautiful radio faces. Something really exciting has happened, which is over the last couple of months, our viewership on YouTube has really gone up a lot. And we think that's because the algorithm is showing us to more people and people are liking what they see. That's one of the wonders of being on an algorithmically enhanced platform like YouTube. It can really bring us to more founders. If you're a listener to this podcast and you want to help us grow, the thing we would like you to do right now, it's the simplest part of the pact, is stop what you're doing, go to YouTube, find our channel. It's easy to search for, or you can get it from our website at tsp.show, and just hit subscribe. Watch some stuff if you like, but even if you listen to us in the podcast app, if you follow us on YouTube, what that does is it is telling the YouTube gods that we're doing something right and that more founders deserve to find this great content. So thank you so much. Go on to YouTube, hit subscribe, and you can rest easy for the rest of the day. The standard startup advice is this: focus, build a single product for a single segment. Once you're succeeding with that, you can expand into adjacencies. That's good advice. We give it ourselves. But what happens when you've succeeded and are ready to explore those adjacencies, or even launch your second product? How do you know what to build, or for whom? What are the traps and pitfalls? How do you manage your chances of success? Joining us to discuss this, we have the perfect guest, Tim Doyle. Tim is one of the smartest and most iconoclastic founders I've ever met. After playing a major role in the success of Koala Mattress, Australia's Casper, but with much better branding, Tim went on to found Eucalyptus, which is one of the country's fastest growing health tech scale-ups. We're excited to have you here. Welcome to the Startup Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're here to talk about expanding beyond your first segment and your first product. Now, you're the founder of Eucalyptus, and I think it has a somewhat unusual founding premise. In fact, Eucalyptus isn't a consumer brand at all. So tell us a little bit about how Eucalyptus works and why you built it that way, especially in the context of creating multiple products.
I guess like going all the way back to the beginning, it's kind of early 2019, and we're thinking about what it means to be a great consumer brand from Australia. One of the constraints that we saw, and I certainly saw at Koala, is there's limitations to how much scale you can actually get in Australia serving Australian consumers. And so you either have this challenge of going international, or you have the challenge of going horizontal and serving multiple different consumers across multiple different offerings in Australia. A lot of digital health businesses around the world looked very similar. What you had in skincare or fertility or men's health or mental health around the world, the infrastructure behind those looked very similar. And so I kind of believed that you could launch a lot of these type of offerings in Australia off the same platform and maybe miss some of the pitfalls and problems that you run into as a single brand consumer business. And we've seen the venture capital landscape littered with failed attempts to build really, really big single brand businesses. And so that was the core insight, was like, maybe we could do multiple off the same platform in order to get to scale it from Australia, where we are, that otherwise would have been very difficult. It's been just over 5 years now. We have 5 brands at the moment. The first one was Pilot, and I would consider Pilot like the simplest brand. It does primarily erectile dysfunction, hair loss, and weight loss. And the main proposition to patients there is convenient access to clinicians and then discreet access to medication and ongoing management of those conditions. And so discretion is relatively simple to build from a technology perspective. And then you have Kin, which is our second brand. And I guess like the step change innovation in Kin is there is much more complex medication management. And so patients have a lot of choice when it comes to contraception, not only like which type of contraception, but which pill within the contraceptive landscape. And so we were seeing a lot of patients come in who were having side effects related to the pill that they were on. And so the challenge for us was to build a system where a practitioner or a doctor could choose the right pill for the patient and manage them through that journey. And so there was some extra building to be done there. Then third brand, Software, which is a skincare brand. And that's all about personalization. So right dosage, right treatment for different patients with different skin conditions. And so you have a lot more personalization on the pharmacy side. And so building the integrations for that was another step. And then I think our biggest brand, which has kind of popped up in the last couple of years, is Juniper. And that does obesity management and a little bit of menopause as well. And the complexity there comes obviously as you have obesity is a much more complicated disease to manage. You obviously have nutrition, exercise, you have the medication itself. And so we've come from discretion only in Pilot to essentially all of care across a team of practitioners that spans from like exercise physiologists to nurses to doctors to dietitians, and they all have to work on one platform serving that one patient. And so you have like a much more complex care journey that started with discretion in Pilot and now 5 years later is very robust across all of preventative health. And then we've recently launched Compound, a new brand for men, which is aimed to be that full preventative health offering that Juniper can be for women, but now back to kind of serving men, which I think is like an interesting full circle, which is Pilot was what it was and is what it is because we could only really afford to do discretion at the time. And we're now so far beyond that there's something much more rich and full, and we've had to build a new brand to encompass that.
One of the things that you've done that I think a lot of founders haven't done has been very intentional from the beginning, right? You've said, okay, we're going to be building up multiple products and multiple brands, but we're going to do it one at a time, and we're going to think about how we build those multiple products. So you've taken that advice of doing one thing first, but you've already started thinking ahead, which I think is why we got you on this show for this topic, Tim. I was going to say every startup needs to go through this. Maybe that's too broad. I would say most startups do. Once you reach a certain level of scale, you need to start expanding, whether it is with new brands and new products or new feature sets or new marketing messages, whatever layer of the stack it's at, you're going to need to go from being one thing to one set of people to more than one thing for more than one set of people. That is the journey that we're talking about here, right? But let's go back to the beginning, Chris. Before we talk about how do we expand into the next adjacencies and so on, one of the things that people do wrong is they don't just build that one thing at the beginning. So why do people have so much difficulty with that discipline?
Yeah, that's right. So, Tim, you just described how your intention from the beginning was to essentially build a kind of portfolio of products and portfolio of companies and portfolio of brands. But you started with one, right? And you have this deep intentionality to do one thing well before then expanding into those other categories or other adjacencies. The challenge is most founders, they either don't have that intention or they have that intention and they don't end up executing that way. And so the question that we have to answer first is, why is this happening, right? And I think there's probably a constellation of reasons, and just to rattle some off, in the early days, you're just trying to find product market fit, right? You're desperately trying to find someone somewhere who'll buy anything from you. And so it's like, oh, you'd like one of those? Yeah, we can make one of those. And oh, you'd like one of these? Yeah, we can make one of these. And they're kind of just trying to learn about the market. In some ways, that can be a good thing because you need to listen and learn and adapt to a market and find a real problem. But in some ways, if you have no instincts, you have no hypothesis, you have no passion about a particular problem domain, that can just kind of be like flapping in the wind and really not circling around product market fit. It's just circling around thrash. But sometimes this kind of behavior is not too bad at the very, very beginning. Then as things evolve, other reasons for this lack of focus start to creep in. Reasons like fear, like, oh my goodness, we need to do more and more stuff before a competitor comes along, or before we don't want to miss that opportunity, so we got to capture that opportunity. The question becomes, an opportunity for what? It's an opportunity to win that account, but maybe it's not an opportunity to scale the business you have. And so there's a kind of a miscategorization or misunderstanding of opportunity.
So many startups are this like B2B service automation, live or die by a few large clients early. And you just see these massive changes in roadmap that end up like crippling, because you think, oh, small bits of infrastructure aren't bad in order to serve a specific client. And then all of a sudden those have layered up and you've got all this debt associated to that. And then you're stuck, and it's such a painful spot to be in.
These things at first appear like big opportunities, and they appear like minor deviations from your plan. And then sometimes worse, they appear like they're on track for your plan. But in all cases, your instinct is wrong. They're often opportunities for distraction. They're not minor deviations, and they're not actually a path to scaling up your business, and they're premature for your plan. You know, there's a saying which is, opportunity at first appears like hard work. Distractions at first appear like opportunities, I think, is another saying that might be coined here. The final two reasons that I think are often underlying this distraction of focus on one product and doing it well is the chasing of revenue, right? There's maybe a capital scarcity, or there's a, let's call it dumb money, who's saying, you need to get to revenue, you need to get it to revenue day one. And it's like, hello, I don't even have a product yet. And then the last reason I think that's most common is just a lack of discipline. Maybe you know all of those other things, but you're the kind of founder entrepreneur who just hasn't seen a deal they don't want to close, and you kind of thrash your team all over the place.
I think what really resonated from my experience there is this idea of really needing to understand what your first proposition actually is. And I think like the really hard part of that is separating your first proposition from your end state proposition. Healthcare is full of this example where it's like the healthcare system is like really fundamentally broken. So it's not hard to find things that are broken. But I see a lot of founders pitch like what I would call the perfect end state. And I'm like, yeah, like that is the perfect end state. There is a lot of incentives and structural concerns and regulatory concerns along the way that will stop you being able to build that. And so having the discipline to know where the first achievable milestone is, know where the first fundable milestone is as well, and then commit to that at the cost of your grand plan is such a hard thing to do, because you want to feel like you're on the way to your grand plan. But a lot of people build every part of their plan to level one, as opposed to some part of their plan to the depth they need to have built it. And I think like that is such a problem.
Yeah, well, we call this MVP pivot, right? And it's like, so they build this like lightweight version and then go do something else.
I think it's about also being pragmatic. And, you know, we've talked about sometimes what you call the ABZ framework, right? Where you do want to know where you want to end up, right? You need to have that vision, and you need to know your vision. You need to be true to that vision. You need to be heading towards that vision. But step one of the vision isn't a mini version of the end state. You want to be strategic about, okay, if that's your end state, what is the set of steps that you need to take, right? And at Amazon, they call it working backwards. And so I think that's often the problem. It's like, oh, okay, you know, if we're going to take on the health establishment, we're just going to build the perfect thing that gets rid of all the terrible incentives. Or if we're going to take on Salesforce, we're going to build a better Salesforce, and we're just going to add all the features. It's like, well, you know what? That's a full frontal attack. Full frontal attacks fail when you're a startup. In fact, we had a recent episode where we talked about this. You need to know your advantage in a David versus Goliath battle before you get to that end state, before you become Goliath yourself, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. Trying to build too many things is really, really a big problem.
There's also a sense, and it often comes from domain experts who are trying to disrupt their own domain, where they have this sense that my product, my business won't work unless we have these 17 features and these 17 categories, because I know how complicated it is and these things are all tightly bound together. And so it's impossible to release a thin slice or deal with this thin slice and go deep on this thin slice. And all the features have to be there before this thing is even viable. And so they don't know what a minimum viable category is. And they don't know how to imagine that minimum viable wedge in the world.
So what's terrifying about minimum viable categories is they're often flawed. Like they're often TAM constrained, or the path from your minimum viable category to your scale version isn't particularly clear. And so people like tentative about taking an imperfect step because like they view the path as like the ordained perfect path. I'm very of the view, and this has been something that has benefited and had cost to us over time, the next milestone is going to be nonlinear. And so you're going to have to be willing to take steps in strange directions in order to ensure that you stay alive and stay funded and kind of can do those things.
You touched on something brilliant there, which is, you know, I talked about one of the reasons people lack this discipline is they have a founder or an investor or an advisor who comes from the old world and they're like, you need to get to revenue day one, and they start to chase the wrong incentive. What you just touched on is a beautiful example of the founder or an investor or an advisor saying, well, I don't see how you're going to get to $1 billion in that category, and therefore you must think broader and get out of that niche immediately. And they're terrified of having a narrow vision in a small TAM because they're not thinking three-dimensionally. It's like, no, this is just the wedge in the world. This is just the first category. It's okay to start in a smaller TAM with a smaller problem set.
And I almost think it's essential in regulated industries because you just don't get access. The biggest thing that kills businesses in regulated industries is the grand plan isn't complete enough to serve the needs of a very difficult industry. And so you end up going like, oh, here is my mini version. And the hospital says like, no way, this isn't complete enough to serve what you intend for it to serve. Whereas like we've gone, well, here is a very small slice that we can do safely, knowing that that slice is tiny. And then being like, all right, now we have the credibility to do the next slice. And so it's such a, I guess like a truffle hound like kind of journey where you just like, where is the next slice? Where is the next slice that I can earn?
So Tim, I think that's the perfect segue to the next thing we wanted to talk about, which is, okay, we're doing the right thing. We've got focus. We're building the one product on the way to achieving our vision. How do you know when it's time to expand into the second product, into those adjacencies?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was like a neat and picky way to say this. I think you have influence from a number of directions, right? You have, how is your first product actually going? There is obviously the danger of jumping off the first product too early if it's working. Like, I think you would have been insane to tell Canva to start thinking about the second product probably before 4 years ago. Whereas in a business like ours, we knew the size of the discretionary-oriented men's health market, and we knew how fast we were ticking up through it, and we could start to see like the marginal CAC of incremental spend start to increase. And so we're starting to see the limitations of what we've built start to emerge. And at the same time, we're starting to see enough stability in the performance of that to trust that we could carve resources out off to something else and start to chase the next opportunity. So I think it's this difficult but practical decision of the slowing of your core and the stability to allow you to start the second thing. And I think like there's no magic to finding that. It's a lot of work.
One of the things that I've heard, Tim, I wonder if this sort of gels with what you're saying here is, you know, the sort of path to growth through this type of expansion is the overlapping S-curves, right? So the S-curve describes basically what happens where there's no such thing as true unlimited exponential growth because we live in a finite planet, right? So what exponential growth looks like is you get the exponential growth and at a certain point it starts to taper off and flatten out. And so I think too early is when you're still at the bottom of the S-curve. You haven't actually achieved that product market fit that gets you on the hockey stick. Remember, a hockey stick, is what I always say, a hockey stick is an incomplete S-curve. There's no such thing as an indefinite hockey stick. So what you want to do is when you start to realize you're getting close to that inflection point at the top of the hockey stick, well, that is a good time to say, okay, we have a mature product. We've put everything we can into that. It is not going to drive that next wave of growth. So now it is time to find that next thing, to stack that S-curve and build up the new product that will deliver that next level of growth.
Yeah, it's so complicated as well. That is the perfect way to think about it. It's a question of like, how do you map where you are on that S-curve? And then how far in advance do you invest in the next S-curve, right? Because like, I'm just reflecting on my own experience here. It's like, I think often about like buying options when we make decisions to do new capabilities. And so like it gives us an example would be launching Compound, which we have now as like a very service heavy business, which is quite low margin because it's very service heavy. It's not a scalable business in its current form, but it teaches us about a set of infrastructure that could potentially become an important part of a scaled version of Juniper down the line. And so how much resource do I put onto Compound? Because it's the start of an S-curve that is way in the future, but one that will be very complicated to build. And so do I start to look on 3-year timelines? And it's such a hard question because you could easily say, well, that's distracting from what's already really working well, which is our core offering. But I can start to see the limitations, and maybe this is just pattern matching to my experience before, but I can start to see where our existing business will start to slow down. And I know that in a year from now, I'll need the new S-curve to be starting. And obviously, the further you get along the path, the more complicated those new S-curves are because you eat all the easy ones early. And so investing into the future and buying these options and building them is such a difficult decision.
And of course, part of the answer to how far to invest into the future is around capital availability, right? All too often, I'll see companies that have 2, 3, 4, 5 bets in the world, but they're barely funded to do one bet. And they're also wondering why they can't raise money is because the first bet hasn't demonstrated traction to the level of fit for a Series A or Series B. And they're like, but we have all this stuff and this incredible technology. And I'm like, it's not about technology. It's about a business and traction and proving that you can scale. And so one reason to not invest ahead of the curve is that you don't have the capital to do that. And you got to make your first S-curve work. Yeah. This is probably a good heuristic.
I think that's actually really interesting to talk about capital, because then we talk about venture capital, which we talk about a lot on this podcast. Tim, Eucalyptus has raised multiple rounds of venture capital. And one of the things that sort of interact, so I think we can join some dots here, is yes, if you have built one S-curve, you've got that business, it earns you the right to raise that next round, to say, look, we've got a business, we know what to do for the next business, we need capital for that business, and we've got a story we can tell. And, which is why venture capital is iterative. We haven't talked about that for a while, actually. Like, why does venture capital have like pre-seed, seed, series A, B, C, D, whatever, until you reach escape velocity? Is because no one's going to give you the Series E, no one's going to give you $200 million on $1 billion valuation when you haven't built anything yet. Right? So it is very much about like, you have to build something, prove that you've de-risked the business, prove that you've got the next thing, and then keep going and keep going.
Yeah, and the inverse of that is also really true. If you raise at the end of your first S-curve and don't have a story that is like the next S-curve, then you're not going to be able to raise. I see this all the time. It's like, give us more money for growth. And it's like, money for growth, like if it was just about money to grow the business, then you'd probably be able to bootstrap it in most cases, right? Like it's pretty rare that you need to pour dollars into doing that unless it's like really a capital intensive business. What you should really be funding with venture in most instances is like second and third bets. And so having those well articulated is so important. And I so rarely see that in a Series A or a Series B deck.
Another bad reason, let's call it an anti-pattern to expand into your next adjacency, is the impulse to say, well, we don't have product market fit. And the answer to this is more features and more categories. Sometimes the category you're in, the product you're in, the problem you're solving, there is no product market fit. It's a dead end, and you've got to find that out the hard way. And often I'll find founders who give up too early or move into the adjacencies too quickly, thinking that's where the product market fit exists. It's this one use case, this one thing isn't enough. And so we've got to expand those adjacencies.
Just over the fence there. Yeah.
It's just over that fence. It's just over that feature, right?
Yeah.
What those founders often forget is there's a lot of work to do between here and that decision. It's sometimes the right decision. It's sometimes that this thing you're in is a dead end, or it requires another category of problem or adjacency to solve. But you've often skipped adjusting your framing. Have you framed the product properly so that the users who are hitting the ads and hitting the landing page and signing up, are their expectations set properly? And are they looking for the thing you actually have? Is the product polished? Do people land in the product with some cognitive understanding of what they're about to experience and how to use the thing? Is it integrated into the right tool chain? So even though it might have a very narrow set of functionality, is it connected to the other products and pieces in the ecosystem in the tool chain such that that thing is useful, that small, narrowly defined thing is useful in a broader set of things? Does it have a Teams version with multiplayer? It's still the same core product solving the same core problem in the same core category, but you are adding some of the wrapping that makes it a useful product.
Yeah, a very nice articulation of this idea of like stability that I touched on a little bit earlier. Your first product has to have the stability, which is like the reliable performance to allow you to think about the second thing. Because if you're jumping to the second thing to patch over the gaps in the first thing, then the first thing's not going to work. And also there's real cost to shifting attention. And so if you haven't got that first thing to work in the way that you expect, you can guarantee that it's going to become an ugly steps to start if the second thing starts to get built, because people love working on the new shiny thing.
Companies like Atlassian, Quora, and 7,000 others use Vanta to build trust and prove security in real time. Automate compliance and start scaling your business today. Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast. The next thing we wanted to talk about, Tim, is around choosing the second product. What you don't want to do is just say, okay, we've got one S-curve, now we're going to build another thing. You're effectively just starting two startups, right, within the same corporate structure. You want to build on the first thing. You want to find a word that I love, but that has been horribly abused, which is synergies, right? You want to, in a sense, think, okay, how do I choose a product that, if we're expanding into adjacencies, if we're building out the capability that actually leverages what we've already got? How do you think about that?
I wouldn't say it's complicated. It just relies on a lot of discipline. I think the most important and first thing is like, what is it going to do for you in terms of your growth opportunity and your scale opportunity? I see a lot of these, and I've made this mistake so many times, which is like very close in terms of distance from your core customer, but smaller opportunities. Particularly in a unit economics obsessed world, they feel like they're additive to the health of your business from the ability to change the economics to the better, whether that's through cross-sell or upsell or whatever it might be. And you end up going like tricking yourself into believing that an incremental small amount of margin on your core is particularly valuable. And the cost of maintaining two things, if that's all you're going to get out of it, is so difficult. And so the discipline to go after the big opportunities and only go after the big opportunities, which is like, I would say like we now only do things if we think they can fundamentally change the shape of the business or the scale of the business. And so does this have the potential to be a peer to Juniper and Pilot, or does it not? And if it doesn't, we just won't do it. And so I think the first thing I would point to is the opportunity of real scale. The second is it synergistic to your infrastructure? So can you actually get leverage? And what is the leverage and where are you getting that leverage? It might be on people, it might be on the patient base, it might be on the technology. And that's a really hard and important question because like often that will be massively overvalued because people think they're building on the same thing, but then end up building something more complicated. And then I think the third one is what is the right way to do this, which is it in a new thing or is it as part of the existing thing? And why do you have the right to win there? Because I think often it just feels like I can go and compete with this other startup because I can. And often like they will be focused and you will be screwed. And so there's a real discipline to that as well.
For me, there are 3 or 4 things I like to think about when we're talking about this, right? So the term we've been using is adjacencies or logical adjacencies. And I think the answer is in the name, right? If you think about the world as concentric circles and the thing you've built, that first thing you built is in the center. The question in my mind is like, what is in that next circle out? What lives beside it? In the customer journey, in the problem categories, in the workflow, in the problems to be solved. That is often a good place to look. And it would be ideal if this thing that's in the next concentric circle out is reinforcing to the core, right? It's somehow adding value to, strengthening, driving feedback loops and network effects. The other thing I'm always looking for is, are people asking for it? You know, I think it's harder to avoid building an adjacency than to build one, right? Because people are all asking, your customers are generally going, geez, I wish your thing also did this other thing. Or there are a whole bunch of partners who are clamoring to get access, and a marketplace is the obvious next thing to go tack onto the thing you're building, right? And so you need to listen. Listen to what your customers are saying and listen for the patterns and listen to, what stack rank based on the signal you're getting. And the last thing I'm always looking for is there a clear mental model whereby I can turn this into a suite? It shouldn't be like Gmail and Google Cloud. It should be like Gmail and Google Docs and Google Spreadsheets and Google Slides. And these fit into a mental model called, Google Workplace. There is a kind of a natural relationship between those things that where I can funnel my users through them and have my users interact between those surfaces.
I actually think it's slightly broader than that. There are quite a few different axes or dimensions across which you can find these adjacencies and synergies. And it's not just one thing. It's not just saying, okay, we expand into a similar product. Mm-hmm. So for example, what you can say is we are moving up the value stack into enterprise. That's a very common adjacency, right? It's the same product, but now we're adding 2-factor authentication and, SOC 2 compliance and all of this stuff. And so we can sell to higher value customers. I would say moving into another country is a special case of an adjacency. And similarly, right, you want to think carefully, like which country do you expand to if you're a business like that? Tim, I think you've got a slightly unusual model, again, because you are in a sense building a house of brands with shared infrastructure, right? And we both geeked out on Procter & Gamble. I remember when we spoke before, and the fact that, they've built this very effectively, and it was part of the inspiration for what you do. So yeah, I'd love your thoughts on how you see adjacencies and the different ways you can find that synergy.
Yeah, well, it's like this question of the same product to new customers, which is kind of like the move up into the enterprise thing. And therefore you're kind of changing the wrapping or some of the feature set to make that appealing to a new group. We do something quite different to that. And I think this is kind of unique to consumer, which is we go searching for an entirely new demographic or customer base that will be able to get value out of the same infrastructure repackaged. Heuristically, it's not entirely different because it's like, what do we need to change to make this valuable to a new set of people, given the core infrastructure that we can get leverage on? And in some cases, that's the enterprise. For us, an enterprise compliance is a small set of things to make it attractive to a different buyer that has a certain set of needs. We will reskin something to make it attractive for a different buyer who has a small set of different needs. And so I think there are actually a lot of parallels there in terms of how do you get leverage on the infrastructure, what small changes you need to make, and then do you get a new customer that is more valuable and at scale? And so, yeah, I actually think what we do when we launch a new brand is very similar to moving up marketing to enterprise. Where is the next logical group of customers that is big enough? How much do we have to change the platform to hit them? And that's kind of what we have to step through.
Yeah, and I think you're really right, Yaniv. The kind of adjacency thinking I was describing is unsurprisingly product adjacencies, since I'm a product guy. And I'm thinking of new categories of products that solve new categories of problems. I think there's at least two other vectors of adjacencies. There's the market segment adjacencies, where you might be moving into enterprise or moving into B2C or something. In your case, Tim, you happen to be moving into whole other brands to target those whole other market types. And then there's geographic adjacencies, where you're moving into other just geographies with the same product. Those are at least three kinds of adjacencies. And there are possibly other vectors where you can move into these logical concentric circles and expand your TAM, expand your unit economics, and grow your business. Let's rotate over now to thinking about the risks and how to maybe mitigate those risks as you're moving into these logical adjacencies, moving into your second product. We have quite a few of them to go through. I think this is going to be a super fun conversation.
Is the way to think about this to like actually map it out, right? Where you're like, okay, this is where we're headed, right? We talked about like, your vision. This is where we are right now. Where is the piece where we get leverage in what we have right now, but are able to open up a new market, either through a new product or through new branding or through, like the how is the strategic piece that comes after the like, okay, what do we actually have that we can leverage in that way?
I'll just go through a walked example here. So we obviously have new markets as well. We only run our obesity business in the UK and in Germany and Japan, and then we run all the brands in Australia. And so there is this real trade-off that gets made all the time now, which is there's three places we could go. There is more features into Juniper Australia, which then probably becomes more features into Juniper internationally. So let's call it like existing Juniper gets better. Then there is a second one, which is more markets for Juniper, which is, a one way to expand the TAM. And then there is a third, which is more features into either all of the brands or into a new brand. And there is this constant trade that's being made, which is like about leverage. We have a small amount of resources to allocate. We have time and dollars. And then we have many different opportunities that are of scale. Which one of these is the best at the time? And I think like it is an individual decision each time, because at the moment we're very invested in features. We've reached 300 million people of TAM. And so we're like, we don't need incremental TAM right now. What we need is defensibility in the service that we have. But if you'd asked me this a year ago, we would have been very obsessed with incremental TAM. And so I think you're right to lay this out as a process, which is like, where is the best leverage to the biggest opportunity? And you've obviously got many different flavors to that.
I think leverage is such a great way of thinking about it. And, leverage comes in lots of flavors, which is why this is not a mechanical process, right? But we've done whole episodes on leverage, and we talk about this a lot. I talked just a few minutes ago about the fact that the thing you don't want to do is kind of start again from zero. There's no point saying, okay, we've built one startup, and now we're just going to build another thing that has no leverage from what we've built before. So it's nearly like the details and the nuances are going to be specific to the company that you're building. But the idea of saying, okay, the adjacencies should be defined as the area of greatest leverage, I think that's actually a really powerful sort of top level framework for how to approach the second product question.
I'd love you guys' opinion on this. So we made this mistake. We got to 4 brands. So let's call the first version of Eucalyptus prescribing and dispensing. So it manages the relationship between the doctor and the patient, and then the relationship between the patient and the pharmacy, and it kind of routes the patient around that world. And so we're like, this is working really well. We're able to do convenience at real scale. It's great. And so we're like, okay, the next thing we need to do is kind of adherence, which is how do we build the long-term management of these patients? Because that will be, really important in the long run. And so we felt that was the biggest opportunity. And when we went to build it, we tried to build like what we called a behavioral platform, which was something that could serve all of those brands and all of those use cases, but at a layer of extra depth. And after 18 months of working on it, we had to abandon it and start again. And I think it was like the right place to go for, but for whatever reason, and I have my own suspicions as why, we couldn't get it to something that was tangible and real enough to actually end up serving the use case. And we ended up with like more Notion docs than we had, actual features that it shipped.
I mean, without knowing all the details, I can talk about some yellow flags that you just mentioned, which may or may not be fair. The first is kind of any effort that takes, how long would you say, 18 some months?
Yeah, it was 18 months.
Yeah, is just too long for a product of anything, right? So what you ideally want to do is figure out a series of incremental features that you can release, minimum viable iterations that are moving in the direction of adherence, right? So maybe it's reminders, and then it's maybe check-ins, and then it's maybe how do you feels, and then it's maybe escalation of concern to a clinician. And it's a series of features in the theme of adherence versus trying to build a super kind of behavioral platform of doom is something that just intuitively from what you said is one of the possible reasons that kind of went off the rails.
So many things in startups are fractal, right? Like we were talking about like the high level A, B, Z, you want to know where you're going and then build incrementally. The same is true at these sub levels. So if you want to build a behavioral platform, you're like, okay, here's our vision. But what's the first piece of it, right? Which is, I think, what you were saying, Chris. Also, I'd say more broadly, I mean, I'm sure there was a lot more to it. Like you said, lots of Notion docs. But when you're talking about a behavioral platform, it does sort of sound like, okay, we've got this sort of high level view, but we're not thinking about it from the point of view of what are like concrete customer pain points or customer value points that we can deliver. I was speaking to some of your team about this at the time, and I think it was very much, it was a little bit like focused on, okay, we want this capability, we think it will increase engagement, but it was maybe less customer focused than it could have been from that point of view.
Yeah, I think that both those things are true, but I think it speaks to this interesting tension around second acts, right? Which is like, we had gotten quite good at what we thought were second acts because we had been replicating the platform to serve new demographics really, really effectively. Like we had gone, probably like in reality, 0 to a couple of 100,000 patients really, really fast. And so we thought like, okay, well, the next logical one is to, instead of going horizontal, to now increase depth. But the heuristics we had around how to increase depth came from the world of going horizontal. And so we completely fucked the attempt to increase depth. And I found it a really interesting experience in like, maybe to make this generalizable, it's like, even when you have a machine that's capable of doing new things, which ours was, when you change the shape of the new thing, you have to go back to square one and plan in the way we've been talking about, which is, like, what does this actually look like? Where is the opportunity? How big is the scale, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, going horizontal is a very different muscle to going deep, right? And I imagine, again, not knowing the details of the business fully, going horizontal is a lot about spinning up these brands, spinning up value props, spinning up operations, spinning up a kind of a relatively thin set of workflows. Going deep is all about data models and journeys and capabilities and what have you, especially if you're thinking about this as an 18-month project. It's a deeper product exercise versus a go-to-market marketing operations and what have you exercise, I imagine, from your muscle memory. So yeah, it's a different skill set.
So coming back to the core question here, where do you get leverage? We were very good at getting leverage on one place in the organization and kind of took it to mean we could get leverage elsewhere. Maybe we just couldn't at that time.
One of the things I think that your systematic approach to building Eucalyptus kind of puts out in the open, but that is true about all startups that reach a certain scale, is that your startup or your company stops being your product and it becomes a set of capabilities for exercising leverage. So it's like you have your competencies, you have your channels. Again, lots of different dimensions for leverage. And they're not fungible, right? Like having one sort of leverage doesn't give you that sort of leverage somewhere else, which I think is what you're saying. And it's nearly like, even if you take, a more traditional approach to building a startup, which is like, I've got one problem I want to solve for my customers. I'm going to listen to my customers. I'm going to solve this embarrassingly narrow piece. Once you reach a certain level of success, you need to start thinking more systematically about what is your organization, what is the machine that you're building, this leverage machine, and how can you continue to exercise that leverage and grow that leverage so that you can continue to succeed in the market.
Yeah. And so my problem that I ran into was, we were building what I thought was anti-fragility through breadth. But the reality is they were all exposed to the same kind of risk, right? Which was they're all the exact same type of business. They might have different shapes to them slightly, but they're the same type of business. And so then I had to go into this, new second act, which was to change the shape of the thing. And I think you're right. You have a set of capabilities. The scary moment is when that set of capabilities is creating a tranche of risk, and then you need to find and make a new capability, which is like truly the most painful version and difficult version of finding a new S-curve, but one that many businesses have to do at scale.
We're talking about this risk of having the wrong muscle or the wrong capabilities for this new adjacency, and in your case, the going deep adjacency. I think another risk is as you get more successful, your team grows, your bureaucracy grows, your risks grow, your risk aversion grows. And so sometimes where you were scrappy and you got that first product stood up real quick and you just learned as you went and you iterated, you can fall into this habit or this trap of like, well, if we're going to go into a new adjacency, we're going to have to validate and learn and research and plan for 18 months and what have you. So that's another aspect to this, perhaps, is there's more capital, more people, more bureaucracy, and it can get in the way of just shipping, iterating, and learning.
For sure. And there's a sunk cost element to that as well, right? You're like, the way that you do things in your core are not the way that you do things in your new bets, because the sunk cost associated with the work that's already been done in your core, you don't want to risk, you don't want to damage that. And so you are more iterative there by the nature of what it is. You've got a $100 million business. You don't want to drastically shake it. But the principles that will apply to your new 0 to 10 thing obviously have to be fundamentally different. And I think like Amazon, unlike anybody else, has been able to pull this off.
I think another big risk here is brand dilution or diffusion, right? So I think one of the hardest things to do when you're starting with this embarrassingly thin, narrow initial product is like, but I have this vision for being this huge, amazing thing. And it's embarrassing to say we're just the erectile dysfunction and hair company, right?
That's why we call it ED.
Yeah, that's right. But not only do you need a narrow product, you need a narrow positioning, and your brand becomes narrowly defined. But then the question becomes, okay, we've had the discipline to build one product and we've had the discipline to position our brand and our value prop narrowly, but now we want to start adding things. There's a risk there of not doing that well enough or doing it too well, and you diffuse or dilute who you are, or you jar your initial customers. I think, Tim, you've solved for this by simply having, discrete brands that are quite disparate from each other. But talking in the general, when we're talking about a group of products that are under one brand, how might you handle the lack of repositioning, the freaking out your customers, or the diffusion, all that brand stuff?
So I reckon one of my fundamental beliefs about branding, customers generally, is that your customers care way, way, way less about you than you actually think. And the amount of mental energy and mental space that you hold in most people's minds is near zero. And so I see so many startups worry about their brand and branding and all of those type of things. And ultimately nobody gives a shit, and you get the opportunity to rebrand 10 times on your journey if you really need to. What you need to make sure that you do is, at the stage that you're at and for the problem that you're solving, you have a clear set of direct response comms that suit that stage, and people will adapt to those comms very quickly. I've never really seen a company go through the product expansion process and then go, oh, but our brand, everyone's upset about the old brand not being properly reflected anymore. It's this fake problem, I think, in most people's minds.
Couldn't agree more. Brands are so elastic, so fungible, so easy to stretch and bend and reposition. You have to be absolutely incredible to get anybody to remember anything about you for any length of time. There's that famous Steve Jobs presentation where he said we have very little ability to get people to remember almost anything about us. And that was when he unveiled the Here's the Crazy Ones campaign. His idea was, we just need them to walk away with a feeling. That's it. And that's so true. And you're not Apple. Whoever's listening to this, you're not Apple.
And don't forget, actually, even if you are Apple used to be called Apple Computer, and they actually made quite a big deal when they dropped the computer from their brand. So exactly to the point here that, a brand is quite a flexible vessel if you take people on the journey.
That's right. So I couldn't agree with you more, Tim. It's just you get to incrementally and sometimes dramatically reposition your brand, and people will go along on that journey, especially if you tell the story as you go. And people go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Let's go.
The only trap is getting too far ahead of yourself, where you try and your brand is the grand vessel for solving your vision, when in reality, you've got to be Apple Computer before you're Apple, that's really, really important from a branding perspective.
I think one of the things I did in my early career, which I would now characterize as immature and childish, is try to be grandiose. We are innovative and revolutionizing the blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, no one gives a shit.
No one gives a shit. And it's also not true. And it's also, people just go, well, give me a fucking break, right? And so I've now become the opposite. It's how pragmatic and straightforward can I be? And how precise can I be about what we do and how we do it and why? And no more. And so you set up that promise well, you set it up clearly, and you get people involved in the story you're telling today and the story you're able to meet today. And then you evolve it slowly as your story and your capabilities expand.
Yeah, and doing that effectively is great branding.
Yes.
So there's just one other risk I wanted to talk about, which is, I was going to say it's wishful thinking, but I was actually thinking on a background thread there. I think this is more like reversion to the mean. And what I mean by that is, when you build your first product and it's succeeded, you have to be really good at what you do. You have to build a great product, but also you have to have a bit of luck on your side, right? I would say every honest founder says there are various points at which we got lucky. And so there's this survivorship bias. The fact that you're moving into that adjacency means you got lucky once. The likelihood on the balance of probabilities is you will be less lucky the second time. And therefore, statistically, it'll be a little bit harder the second time than it was the first time. And so you need to have enough leverage in other areas to sort of compensate for that. But I think it can be easy to think, well, we did it once, we can do it again. And I think, weirdly, I've seen this enough time. It seems harder the second time, but reflecting on it, I think it is that sort of statistical kind of bias that leads that to be the case.
This is so, so, so true. You need to apply, whether it's a discount factor or some kind of margin of safety, because you kind of definitely will overstate your ability to get things done, the speed at which you can do them. And just by the nature of you're using existing things, when you're creating something from scratch, every problem was solved specifically for that thing. When you using your existing infrastructure to create a new thing, it's going to be less good. And so your leverage that you get from that first thing has to be so significant that it covers for the fact that you're not building for purpose 100% of the time. And so in like Eucalyptus, like what we can do is we can kind of market our way out of being not fully ready from a product perspective or whatever it might be. We can rely on the muscle that is, like, my view is that like most organizations do one thing really well. We can rely on the muscle that we do really well to give us space and time and a margin of safety to get the rest of the thing really good.
You might call this the Google strategy with AI, actually, or the Apple strategy, right? They're like, we don't have to rush, calm down. We do some stuff really well, and we'll deploy the AI thing when we're good and ready and when we've dialed it in.
Is there one thing above all others that you wished you'd known before you built your second product?
Definitely the cost of managing concurrency in technology. Like, in my head, small iterations from a use case perspective to manage the needs that were like seemingly adjacent for different patients would not slow us down substantially. And like, it cost us years. The thing that now is like the hallmark of our product strategy is like discipline around use case and the idea that we think platform first as opposed to kind of individual use case first. And I think like that has been such a painful lesson because we ended up with like, and I think this idea of like, I talk about it as like fractal planning, where it's like you end up planning for every individual use case, when in reality, what you should do is just kill most of the use cases. And that has been so hard to learn in terms of the expansion into new things, is the discipline to stay ambitious and platform first. And I just wish I had that. If someone could come back and shake me when I like the start of this depth journey and be like, it will require so much more self-discipline than you have currently shown, I think we would have been benefited hugely as a business.
I wish we'd met 12 months ago then in that case. You know, yeah, it reminds me, eBay used to have a different code base per category. And it was, and I think per country, and it was a complete nightmare of verticality, right? And I couldn't agree more with you, Tim. Like, we've talked about leverage. We've talked about using your core competencies as you think about your next adjacency. And it really is about creating these shared surfaces, these shared capabilities, right? Like notification tray, identity management, profile management, news feeds, dashboards. These are surfaces inside which you can build second or third categories. In your case, it's underlying core infrastructure, core capabilities that can be expressed in different brands. If you're not building leverage into your second, third, fourth adjacency, then you're just pancaking your company.
I think that's true. But Tim, I think maybe what you're saying is something a little bit more than that, which is something I've definitely experienced, which is moving from one of something to N, where N is greater than one. So from 1 to 2, that is the big change. That's the big transition, because you go from having like an assumption where everything's always the same. You've added an extra degree of freedom, an extra variable where you're like, okay, is it product A? Is it product B? It shows up in the code base. It shows up in the product. It shows up in the planning. It shows up in the resource allocation. Like all of these things where you just had one of something. Having one of something is like that dimension doesn't exist. When you move to 2, you've got all of these things to think about, all of these decisions to make, all of these priorities to balance. And so always when you go from 1 to N, like Chris, that eBay thing, it sounds insane, but actually there's a lot of benefit, right? Because at least in the short term, because the code base was like, okay, at least if we're eBay for electronics, we can hard code a bunch of stuff for electronics without having if statements everywhere or without having to like reimagine our whole architecture. That is a cost. Going from 1 to 2 or from 1 to N, that is not one that, is sort of intuitive until you felt it.
Which takes us all the way back to the beginning of the episode, right?
It does.
When people stumble into unintended adjacencies, they chase revenue, they chase customers, any customer they can sell, and they stumble into category 2, 3, 4, they start paying massive tax across their tech stack, across their executive stack, their customer support stack, all of this stuff. And it just radically bogs everything down. And so when you do it more intentionally and you build just one product and then move into N, that stuff doesn't disappear. It doesn't, it doesn't evaporate. It's just you're choosing when to engage with it intentionally. It becomes a geometric problem. Exciting as hell. If you do it well, you are unlocking incredible leverage and incredible capabilities in your business, but it's hard and it's costly and you need to do it well.
Okay, I think that is the perfect place to put a bow on it. We've come full circle. Building your second product, it's an amazing thing. It's something you'll probably need to do it one day, but it is hard and don't underestimate it. Thank you, Tim, so much for sharing your expertise on this. It's been really valuable, I think, for us and for all of our listeners. And it was for that reason that we really wanted to have you on the pod for that topic. So thanks so much.
Tim, how can people find you on the internet and follow up with you if they're interested in what you're doing and what we talked about today?
So the website's eucalyptus.vc. That's caused me a lot more pain than I thought it would at the start, but there it is. And I'm not going to respond on any of the other channels. And so that's probably your best chance. Come work for us. So we're hiring across product engineering growth at the moment. So that's probably the best thing that I can ask you.
Remote friendly? Do you hire offshore?
We hire in the UK.
Yaniv?
I'm mostly on LinkedIn. You can find me there. I'm the only Yaniv Bernstein on LinkedIn, or in fact on the internet, so I'm pretty easy to find. Also, some of my spiciest stuff is on X at @ybernstein. How about you, Chris?
I'm on LinkedIn and all the social media as Chris Sard, or you can find me at chrissard.com and chrissard.com/newsletter, where you can subscribe to my newsletter there. All right, guys, great conversation as always.
Yep,
Thanks.
absolutely. Thanks so much for coming on, Tim. Cheers. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. To sell to the enterprise, proving security is essential. Vanta allows you to breeze your way through to SOC 2, ISO 27001, or Essential 8 compliance and unlock major growth for your company. Go to vanta.com/TSP today. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to claim your $1,000 off.